Hello again, grade 12 learners. Today we're looking at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're going to focus on the November 2012 exam. Last year the exam was on the TRC, and the main question was, how did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, deal with South Africa's past? Now, in terms of this theme, you need to understand what the TRC was, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what it was about, why it was formed, and when it was formed. So you need to know the aims of the TRC, you need to know the commissions. And in terms of why it was formed, it's also very important to know South Africa's past. So what was the problem with South Africa's past that prompted the government that took over in 1994 to come up with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? So if you look at the focus question, it will change from year to year. As I said to you, this was last year's paper, November 2012. This year, it might not be the question, but the skills that we'll be focusing on today will help you to answer any question that you might find in this exam. And what I will start by doing is to look at how you unpack a source in order to understand the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So even before you read the questions and you attempt to answer them, it's very important that you understand the source and you know how to unpack it. If you do that and you do it properly, then you will save a lot of time. Now let's look at the sources and see how you unpack a source. So as you can see here, it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Question 1, you get a written source. The instruction says, the source below comprises two sources on the aims of the TRC. So you already know that both these sources, both the visual and the written source, even though we're going to start with the written source, are going to focus on the aims of the TRC, why the TRC came into being. This is part of a speech that Desmond Tutu delivered at the first hearing of the TRC held in East London in April 1996. So reading captions in history is very, very important. If you look at that caption, it gives you the context of the source, because later on you might get a question asking you when the TRC came into being, who was the chairman of the TRC. Already you know that it was Desmond Tutu. He was in charge of the TRC, and the first hearing was in April 1996, and it was in East London. You already know that. And then the main point has already told you here that this is about the aims of the TRC. So even before you read the source, you already have got that information. Now let's go to the source itself and see how you unpack it. Desmond Tutu said, we are charged to unearth the truth about our dark past. Now remember, our main question was, how did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission deal with South Africa's past? Now this source is already telling you that South Africa's past was dark. So as a history student, you should know that Bishop Tutu was referring to apartheid. And then in terms of the aims of the TRC, to unearth the truth. So that would be one aim. And then he carried on to say, to lay the ghosts of that past so that they will not return to haunt us. So where's another aim here? It was to lay the ghosts of that past. That was another aim of the TRC. So already you've got two aims. The first one was to unearth the truth, and then the next one, to lay the ghosts of that past so that they will not return to haunt us. So that is the reason why they needed to uncover the truth. And that we will thereby contribute to the healing of a traumatized and wounded people. See, that is another aim. So the healing of a traumatized and wounded people is another aim. So I'm quickly going to write on top of it that that was another aim of the TRC. So again, already we have 3 aims: to unearth the truth, to lay the ghosts of the past, and to heal a traumatized and wounded people. For all of us in South Africa are wounded people. And in this manner, to promote national unity. That would be another aim, to promote national unity and reconciliation. Hence the name, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We want to indicate that those who testify before the Commission will enjoy the same privilege as in a court of law for the testimony that they give, provided what they say is the truth as they understand it. So if you look at that line, provided what they say is the truth as they understand it, that was the condition of the TRC. Because in your learning, you will already know that there were conditions to getting amnesty. Not everyone was going to be granted amnesty. People had to reveal the whole truth. They had to prove that the crimes committed during the apartheid times were politically motivated, because if they were not politically motivated, then they would have to go to a normal court of law and be prosecuted there. So that was not the aim of the TRC. The aim of the TRC was to deal with South Africa's past, in other words, only look at politically motivated crimes. And provided what they have done is done in good faith. And then, so that was the written source. Now let's look at the visual source. Remember, when we started, I told you that the source below comprises 2 sources on the aims of the TRC. So both the written and the visual sources are on the same thing. They are on the aims of the TRC. So we've looked at the written source and we've looked at the aims and the conditions. Now let's see if the written source agrees with what is in the visual source. Now this is a cartoon. Now remember, history students, everything that you see in the cartoon is there for a reason. It's not like a photograph, like I've said before, where if I want to take a picture of a person and there are things behind that person, they will also appear in the picture because they happen to be there. But with a cartoon, what happens is a historian decides what they want to include there. And it doesn't matter how little the thing might seem, there is a reason why it is there, because the cartoonist wants to convey a specific message about the event. So if we look at this cartoon, it's got Dala Omar. Now those of you who have a very good knowledge of general events, you will know that Dala Omar was the Minister of Justice during the apartheid times. But even if you don't know, it's not a problem. Okay, let's say you don't know who Dala Omar was, you just see a person. Okay, now the most interesting thing that you need to note is that this person is holding a lamp. Okay, here it is, and it's written Truth Commission. And he is walking towards this haunted house. How do you know that this is a haunted house? It's very dark, as you can see, and also it's labeled South Africa's past. Now, he is walking towards that house to bring light to it. Now, you remember when we looked at the written source, Bishop Tutu said to unearth the truth about our dark past. So already you can see that these 2 sources agree. They work together. The one shows it in a visual form. And then Dala Omar says, if we don't find out what's in there, it will keep on haunting us forever. And that is exactly what Bishop Tutu said as well. Said, if we don't unearth the truth, if I can go back, he says here, to lay the ghosts of that past so that they will not return to haunt us. So already you can see that these sources are exactly the same. They're just represented in a different format. So those are the two sources that you will be working with. Now let's look at the types of questions you are going to get from these sources. Question 1. According to Desmond Tutu, what were the aims of the TRC? Now that is very, very important, grade 12 learners, that it's not according to you. It's not according to any other person, but it's according to Desmond Tutu, this person who was the chairman of the TRC. Okay, we've already looked at the source where he was talking about the TRC and what their aims were. So according to him, the aims of the TRC were to unearth the truth about South Africa's past, to lay the ghosts of the past, to heal the people that were traumatized, and to promote national unity and reconciliation. Now, if you look back at the source, those are the things we've already underlined when we're unpacking the source. Remember what I said to you when we started? That if you unpack your source, that will save you a lot of time. So we've already saved a lot of time. We don't need to go back to it because everything is underlined and everything is already there. And then we look at the next question. Explain the term reconciliation in your own words. That means this is not in the source. If you look at the possible answers there, to restore friendly relations amongst former enemies, bring together opposing parties and establishing good relations, reconcile past differences for the common good of South Africa. So there, if you get a question like that, it's any possible answer provided that it is relevant. So in other words, you can't just make things up. So when we look at 1.3, the main points that I'm going to underline are the victims and perpetrators. It's very important that in your answer, you give an answer that will show both the victims and the perpetrators and how they were going to attend the TRC. Now, let's look at a possible answer here. Those who testified were promised either amnesty or reparations. Now, you can see from this answer that both victims and perpetrators are represented. So that was amnesty for the perpetrators and reparations as well. So make sure that your answer answers both for the victims and the perpetrators. If perpetrators speak the truth, they would receive amnesty. Those who attend will enjoy the same privilege as in a court of law. And then the next question is, what message does the cartoonist convey about the TRC? Now remember I told you that everything in the cartoon is there for a reason. So I'm going to underline the word message there. That means, what is the cartoonist trying to tell us about the TRC? So you've already interpreted the cartoon, you've looked at what each element stands for, and the possible answer there is the need for the TRC. Remember when I showed you the lamp and I said it's showing the light that is going to that haunted house that was South Africa's past. So the aim, just like the written source said, was to unearth the truth. The TRC was to bring about reconciliation. South Africa had a haunted past, hence the haunted house. Then the next question is, explain what prompted Dalla Omar to make the following statement. If we don't find out what's in there, in that haunted house that he was heading towards, it will keep on haunting us forever. So that is the visual source. If you look at this question, it does tell you that you're supposed to look at the visual source, not the written source. Explain what prompted him to make that statement, that if we don't find out what's in there, it will haunt us forever. So in this type of question, you're expected to use your own knowledge of the TRC and South Africa's past to understand why Dala Omar said that. The possible answers there are, there were many atrocities that were committed and had to be brought out in the open. He obviously expected full disclosure. Omar knew about many victims that were killed by the apartheid government. So he had lived through apartheid. He knew that there were lots of people who were killed by the government, but people did not know about these things. That is why it was important for the TRC to uncover them. Bring closure to both victims and perpetrators. So remember, a lot of the victims wanted the perpetrators to come forward and apologize. Just say, I'm sorry, even though that was not the condition of the TRC. But they just wanted to face them, to see these people who had committed the crimes in order to find closure and also to find out what had happened to their loved ones. Because remember what we said when we looked at the written source? Most of South Africa's past was hidden from the people. People did not know what happened. That is why the TRC's aim was to unearth the truth. Then if we look at the next question, compare the visual and written sources. Now, when you're comparing, you are looking for similarities. Compare. When you get that command, please don't look for things that are different between these sources. Now, remember when we are unpacking the sources, I did look at those things that were similar. The statement did tell you that both sources were about the aims of the TRC. So now you need to take things out from both sources that are similar. That is what comparing means. So you'll be looking for similarities. So you're comparing the visual and the written sources, and then you explain how these sources support each other regarding the reasons for the formation of the TRC. You already know that both these sources are about the formation of the TRC. Now you want to see how they're similar. Now let's look at the possible answer here. Both sources indicate the need for the TRC to bring about reconciliation. Remember, we said, Bishop Tutu said, South Africa will be haunted forever if the truth is not unearthed. And then Dala Omar also said, if the TRC does not go into that haunted house, then that will haunt the country forever. So in order to move forward, in order to reconcile, it was very important that they uncovered everything about South Africa's past. Both sources indicate the atrocities that were committed by perpetrators. Now remember, Bishop Tutu did say that the past, South Africa's past, was dark. So that refers to the atrocities that were committed by perpetrators during the apartheid times, and those had to be revealed so that the victims could get closure. So that is how you compare the sources. You find things that are similar. And then the next question is question 2, which now refers to a different source. Now, before we look at this question, let's look at the source. The next source is an extract from a testimony given by Nomonde Qalata to the TRC in East London on the 16th of April 1996. Mrs. Qalata's husband, Fort Qalata, was one of the Klerk 4 that were murdered by the South African police. Now already you can see, if you look at that he was murdered by the South African security police. So this is testimony from the victim. Remember, we did say that the TRC was about giving an opportunity to both the perpetrators and the victims to come forward and tell the truth about South Africa's past. Now, I'm not going to read the entire source, but what I'd like you to take note of in this source is that Mrs. Talata did not know what happened to her husband. And how do we know that? First of all, she says that the husband did not come back home as he promised. I knew that he was always being followed by the police, obviously, and harassed by the police. Okay, and then it goes on to say that she was delivering the newspapers and all that, and then she looked at the headlines, and one of the children said that could not see his father's car and all that. And what she says here is, I was afraid of what might have happened to my husband. I was afraid of what might have happened to my husband. She didn't know what happened to her husband, so that is why the TRC was very important for her, because she wanted the perpetrators to tell her what happened to the husband. Now, if you read this entire source, obviously we don't have time to read the entire source, you will see that the husband was followed by the security police, and the family did not know. He just disappeared. So now the police needed to come forward and tell her where they took him, what happened to him, and if he was killed or not. And then another very important thing I'd like you to take note of is that Mrs. Talata was very emotional during the proceedings. Again, that is giving you more information about the TRC and how South Africa's past affected people. And Mr. Smith, who was there with Mrs. Talata, said, Mr. Chairman, may I request the commission to adjourn, maybe for a minute? I don't think the witness is in a condition to continue at the present moment. So obviously, he could see that Mrs. Talata was very emotional about what happened to her husband. That is why he asked for the commission to adjourn. And then there is a photograph that shows, and it tells you, an emotional Mrs. Talata. Already you can see that she is emotional. She looks like she is crying, and there is a commissioner there supporting her. She's giving her testimony in East London. Okay, now let's look at the questions. So you've already unpacked the source, you've looked at the emotions, you've looked at the story behind why she wanted to come before the TRC. We know she wanted to find out the truth about her husband. She didn't know what happened to him. All she knew was the husband did not come back home, he just disappeared. Now let's look at the questions and how you can answer them. Why do you think Mrs. Talata decided to give her testimony at the TRC? And the possible answer there is, she wanted to know what happened. It's exactly what I told you, that she went there in order to find out the truth about what happened to her husband. She wanted disclosure about her husband's death. She wanted the police to come forward and tell her what they did to her husband. Now remember, from the first source we read by Desmond Tutu, he did say that South Africa's past was hidden. People did not know what happened. Talata wanted to reveal her side of the story, and obviously to show how she was affected. And then the next question is, what motivated Mr. Smith to request for an adjournment of the hearing? Now remember that word I underlined, where Mrs. Talata was sobbing because she was emotional. Now if you look at the answer, it's because Mrs. Talata was crying, sobbing. She became very emotionally affected. So that is why the TRC had to, the proceedings have to stop for a short time, while she was obviously composing herself. Then later on, they carried on. Explain why you would regard this source as valuable to a historian studying the work of the TRC. why is this source valuable to an historian studying the work of the TRC? Another word for this could be useful, because sometimes examiners will not use the word valuable. So you'll find that maybe in this year's exam they've used useful. So in other words, why is this source going to help the historian who is investigating the work of the TRC? So you've seen the written source, you've seen the photograph of Mrs. Kalata, and obviously she was affected. She was the victim, and she was there when her husband was taken away. You can see that from the testimony she gave. And then the possible answer there is that it is a real life experience. It's a personal account. So that will help historians get first-hand information from somebody who was there at the time. It's a primary source. It reveals the brutality of the apartheid system, because Mrs. Kalata did say that her husband was killed, but all she wanted to know was how the police did it. It shows how the TRC wanted to help people to find closure or reconciliation. So that is another way this source can help historians, because she went there wanting to find closure. Because remember, initially she said, I didn't know what might have happened to my husband. So by going to the TRC, she was going to face the perpetrators, who were then going to tell her the whole truth about what they did to their husband. So that is where closure was going to come in. So she needed closure. All she knew was that the husband disappeared, but she didn't know exactly what happened, all the details of how he disappeared. And then, in order to find closure, it was very important for her to know that. The presence of testimonies shows that people had a need to find closure. So that's the same thing. Okay, we've done 2 questions where we were looking at how you unpack the sources, how you analyze them, interpret, and answer the questions. Now, let's have a break, and when we come back, we're going to look at a different type of source. Welcome back. As I promised before the break, we are now going to look at a different kind of a source. And remember, I spoke to you about unpacking a source. Now, if you remember what I did before break, I was underlining and circling and highlighting and even writing on top of the source, where we were looking at the aims, the similarities, and so on. I suggest you do the same thing in the exam, because you need to remember that exam paper is yours. And if you underline and highlight and do all the things I was doing earlier on, that will also save you a lot of time, because when you go back to the source, you won't have to read the entire source. Remember, there's a lot of reading in history, and you don't want to waste time. So unpacking a source involves all the things I was doing before the break. I'm not just doing these things for TV, but I'm showing you how you need to unpack the source when you are writing that exam. Don't forget to do that. It's very, very important. Now, let's move on and look at another source. We're still looking at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're looking at source 3. Again, it's very important to read the caption, remember, in history, and you can also underline, circle, highlight, and all that. This source is from an interview held by Lerato Mbele with F.W. de Klerk. Now, history students, you already know who F.W. de Klerk was. He used to be the president of South Africa before the democratic elections in 1994. So he was president from 1989 up to 1994. So you have F.W. de Klerk there. You already know from your own knowledge that he was representing the National Party. So you can just write NP there. Rolf Meyer, even if you don't remember who he was, it doesn't matter, but his name should tell you who he was. He was also the National Party person who represented the party at the negotiation process. And then you have Cyril Ramaphosa, who represented the ANC. Now, I said to you, we are looking at the different type of source. So we are looking at the different views. So even before you read this source, you know that these people are not going to say the same thing about the TRC. Because if you look at South Africa's past, these people came from different camps. The National Party was the government, the ANC was the liberation movement fighting the government. So obviously they're bound to view the TRC in a different way. Now again, we don't have time to read the entire source, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to underline what I think are the very important points from the source. So we're going to start with what F.W. de Klerk said. Started by saying the TRC process was flawed. So already you know that F.W. de Klerk was against the TRC. And then he goes on to say why it was flawed. That there are lots of atrocities or the killings of people that were not properly investigated by the TRC. So the TRC only chose which atrocities to look at. So he gives examples of the top IFP leaders who were not investigated. I mean, whose atrocities were not investigated. The black-on-black violence was also not investigated. And then he goes on to say that these flaws create an imbalance. So according to de Klerk, the TRC was not only flawed, but it was not balanced. So he argued that it only looked at one side. It didn't look at all the sides as it had claimed. Because again, remember the sources we started with before the break? Bishop Tutu said that the aim of the TRC was to give equal opportunity to both the victims and the perpetrators. Now, F.W. de Klerk is responding to the work of the TRC. Remember, this was said in 2006. It was 10 years later. The TRC was, the first hearing was in 1996. Now it's 2006 when F.W. de Klerk says this. And he's looking back and sort of critiquing the TRC. And he argued that it was flawed. It was imbalanced. So in other words, he was not supportive of the TRC. So when you're reading this source, you need to take out all these things. He also says there is unfinished business. So the TRC did not unearth the entire truth, as it had claimed to do. And then he says, but now we must live with the spirit of the Constitution. We must have Ubuntu instead of seeking vengeance. So he's saying, again, he's claiming that the TRC is sort of seeking vengeance instead of moving forward and reconciling the different sides that we're fighting under apartheid. We should have a reparation instead of retaliation. In other words, people should not want to pay back. They should come together. If prosecutions go ahead, now remember that Bishop Tutu had said that if people told the truth, and also from your knowledge, you know that if they proved that the crimes were politically motivated, then they will be protected from prosecution. In other words, they would be given amnesty. So now de Klerk's saying that those prosecutions should not carry on. He claims that if prosecutions go ahead, they must be even-handed. So in other words, people should be treated equally, whether they were perpetrators or the victims, it doesn't matter. There must be prosecution of undisclosed crimes from all sides, not just from one side. So again, earlier on, he did say that it was flawed, it was imbalanced. They only looked at the one side. So now he is saying that if people were prosecuted for not telling the whole truth, for not proving that the crimes were politically motivated, then it should happen to everyone, not just those people who were working for the government during the apartheid times. So in other words, he's saying that the TRC should not protect those people who were fighting the government, because that is what the TRC was blamed for. Okay, so as I said to you, I'm not going to read the entire source. Now let's look at what Cyril Ramaphosa said. Remember earlier on I told you that Cyril Ramaphosa was from the ANC. So he's obviously giving a different view of the TRC. So he starts by saying F.W. de Klerk uses emotive, that is sensitive words when he says witch hunt. So Cyril Ramaphosa is accusing F.W. de Klerk of referring to the TRC process as a witch hunt. In other words, they were after those people who were perpetrators and protecting other people who might have been perpetrators just because they were from a different side. So again, remember, he is the ANC person. So he is bound to have different views. And then he goes on to say the term witch hunt has never been part of the lexicon or the dictionary of the New South Africa. So that is one thing where they agree on, that South Africa needs to move forward, that we need to reconcile. So he's justifying the work of the TRC, and he's saying it was not about a witch hunt, it was about reconciling the people. Nelson Mandela, in leading this country to unity and reconciliation, made sure that there would not be any blanket witch hunt type of process. We are not accustomed to witch hunts. We are, however, as an emerging democracy, accustomed to justice. That's another thing. Where F.W. de Klerk had said if prosecutions do go ahead, they should be even-handed. And Cyril Ramaphosa is saying there should be justice. F.W. de Klerk said there should be reconciliation and not retaliation. Ramaphosa is saying justice needs to take place. So that is where they differ. Remember, I did start by saying that because they came from different sides, they were bound to differ. If the crimes were committed in the past by whomever, and no application for amnesty. Now you remember that that was one of the conditions of the TRC. That people had to apply for amnesty, they had to come forward and meet all the conditions of full disclosure and proving that the crimes were politically motivated. So he says, and no applications for amnesty was made when the opportunity was there. That means when the TRC was in place. Now you'll remember that the TRC completed its report in 1998. So this is happening in 2006. So he is saying that those people who did not use the opportunity when it was given to them should then face the full might of the law. There should be justice. We should not just talk about reconciliation, but those people need to pay because they did not use the opportunity when it was given to them. So he says justice must prevail. Now let's look at the types of questions you're going to get. You've unpacked the source, you've found the differences, as we said before that they were bound to differ. Now let's look at the types of questions you can get from this type of source. Using the information from the source and your own knowledge, you need to comment on whether you would agree with F.W. de Klerk's statements that numerous atrocities of the past have not been properly investigated. Okay, this is an open-ended question, but it is based on your knowledge of the TRC. Would you agree with what F.W. de Klerk said, that there were some atrocities of the past that were not properly investigated? So if you look at the possible answer, it says candidates need to comment on whether they agree or disagree. So that means you can agree or disagree with the statement as long as you provide evidence. And it's not just made up evidence, it is informed evidence from your own knowledge of the TRC. So it really doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree. What matters is the type of evidence you give to support your answer. Now let's look at the first one. The first option would be to agree. The process was not open and inclusive. The murder of the IFP members were not investigated. That is from the source. F.W. de Klerk did say that the murder of IFP members was not investigated, therefore the TRC was flawed. He also mentioned the fact that the so-called black-on-black violence was not investigated. There were many other ANC atrocities that were not investigated. That is from your own knowledge. So in other words, you would agree with F.W. de Klerk that the TRC did not look at all the atrocities. But there is room to disagree with that statement. So if you choose to disagree, then you would say, obviously, as a person who was from the National Party that was in government during the apartheid times, he would be against the TRC, especially because he was implicated in that so-called black-on-black violence. Now again, history students, you will remember the Third Force and its role in the violence leading up to the 1994 elections. The cases that were investigated by the TRC brought about healing for both perpetrators and the victims. We already know that from the aims of the TRC. Therefore, you would disagree with what F.W. de Klerk was saying. Now, how do the views of F.W. de Klerk and Cyril Ramaphosa differ regarding the work of the TRC? Now, this is a very important question. It's not asking you why, but they're asking you how. That is where you need to use the source and look at the differences. So you are contrasting the sources. Make specific reference to the word witch hunt. See, this question is telling you exactly what to focus on. Don't look at other things, but you need to focus on the word witch hunt. So in other words, how do these two political figures view a witch hunt? Now, if you look at the answer, F.W. de Klerk implied that the work of the TRC was a witch hunt because it only focused on the atrocities committed by the National Party. It didn't look at the other side or all sides. It only looked at one side. And then when you look at Cyril Ramaphosa, who was representing the ANC, he stated that the new government was not doing things undercover and that it was not a witch hunt. And he said, this is the evidence from the source again, opportunity for justice to prevail. So in other words, those people who did not use the opportunity to come forward and tell their stories to the TRC had to then be prosecuted. That is how these two leaders differed. So that is how you need to contrast the sources. You are looking at how they differ. Now let's look at the next question. Now you need to refer to sources 1, 2, and 3. Remember, we dealt with sources 1 and 2 before the break, and then after the break we looked at source 3. You need to select, okay, that means you choose, select and explain which one. Don't do all of them, just do one. Of these sources you would regard as the most useful to a historian studying the work of the TRC. Now, we've come across this term useful before, or valuable, to a historian studying the work of the TRC. Again, this is up to you which source you choose, as long as you support your choice with relevant evidence from the source. Now, let's look at the possible answers there. So, you can choose either source source 1, source 2, or source 3, and then indicate how it was useful. So if you choose source 1, you'll say it was useful because it does give information about the workings or the aims of the TRC. Remember, it was that source about the aims of the TRC by Archbishop Tutu, and then there was a visual source underneath it where Dala Omar is holding a lamp walking towards the haunted house. It gives information as to why the TRC was necessary in order for the country to move forward, to reconcile. It shows that many hidden crimes took place in South Africa. Bishop Tutu did say that South Africa's past was dark. It was hidden. So people, or the TRC, needed to unearth the truth. It was an account by Tutu as a chairperson of the TRC. Remember, that is what I started with, that when you're looking at the caption of the source, and it tells you that there was a statement made by Bishop Tutu, you already know that he was in charge of the TRC. If you choose source 2, you would say, yes, it is useful to historians because it gives testimony from a victim. Mrs. Talata, whose husband was killed during the apartheid times. A well-known activist was killed during the apartheid times, and it's also an eyewitness account. It's a primary source because she was there and she obviously came forward to find the truth from the TRC. And then if you choose source 3, you would say it is useful because these are the interviews by senior political leaders that can be very useful, and they give us opposing views, and that is very, very important in constructing history. So remember, we looked at that source 3, and you said one was by F.W. de Klerk, who was the leader of the National Party, and then the other one, Cyril Ramaphosa, who represented the ANC. So if you look at source 3, it actually does give us a balanced picture of the TRC because it's showing us the different sides and how they viewed the TRC. So I thought that was a very interesting source because it shows you that different people look at the TRC in different ways. Now I'd like us to move on to the extended writing. In an interview with Tim Modise, again, this is just an example. Okay, I just want you to focus on the skills, how you can answer this question. In an interview with Tim Modise, Desmond Tutu said that we did get a fair amount of the truth. So in your answer, you will be focusing on this quotation by Desmond Tutu. He said, we did get a fair amount of the truth. Now, using the information from all the sources, we've worked through all the sources. Remember 1, 2, and 3. We've looked at the written sources, we've looked at the visual sources. Now, using all those sources and your own knowledge, you will also remember that throughout working through those sources, we kept on referring to own knowledge of the TRC. Because remember, grade 12s, you are not going to walk into that exam room without knowing anything about the TRC. Some people believe that you don't have to study for a source-based paper, but you do, because you need to read the sources in context. If you don't understand the context, then you will not understand the source. Now, what do you have to do? You need to write an essay. Now, this is very important. As soon as you see the word essay, what does that tell you? It tells you that your writing will have an introduction. It will have a body that is divided into paragraphs, and then a conclusion. Those are 3 parts of an essay. You are not going to answer this question in point form, because if you do that, then it's not a coherent essay. In order to have a coherent essay, you need to have those 3 parts. An introduction, which obviously looks at that statement, whether the TRC did give a fair amount of the truth or not, because that is what you are trying to prove. And then another very interesting word here is you are assessing. Now, what does assess mean? That means you are judging. You need to give both the positives and the negatives. You are judging the accuracy of this statement. So is it true or not that the TRC did get a fair amount of the truth? So again, it's very important for a history student to understand these commands. Assessing means you need to weigh the argument. You are a judge and you're going to say whether this was accurate or not. And you are using both information from the sources and your own knowledge. Now let's look at the marking guidelines here. And remember, these are just guidelines, and they will be written in point form, obviously, because this is to help the teacher's marking. So in terms of the essay, this is how you'll be marked. These 3 points are very important. The markers will be looking at how you construct your argument and how it develops. Remember, when you move from one point to the next, you use linking words. It has to flow. Okay, you're not writing in point form. This is a coherent piece of writing you are arguing here. So they look at how well you construct your argument. They would look at how you select factual evidence to support the argument. So remember, you're using all the sources to construct this argument, and you are not rewriting the sources. So the selection of evidence is very, very important. I'm going to underline that. Selection of factual evidence to support your argument. So you've already taken a side, or a stand. Okay, so you've said, well, that statement is accurate or it is not accurate. Then when you look at your sources, 1, 2, and 3, you are not going to just give back everything that is in those sources, but you're going to select the relevant points that are going to support your argument. And then another very important thing is how you interpret the question. Do you understand the question? So you are not just writing about the TRC, but you are focusing on that statement. If I can go back to it. In an interview with Tim Modise, Desmond Tutu said that we did get a fair amount of the truth. That is your focus. Did the TRC get a fair amount of the truth? That is what you'll be assessing. So please make sure that you don't start writing about the different committees of the TRC and what they did and all that. You are trying to prove or disprove this statement that the TRC did get a fair amount of the truth. And then I'm going to go on and just show you the possible answers. If you look at the synopsis, it says here, candidates should indicate whether the statement is accurate or not. So in other words, you need to take a stand. If you don't know what stand you've taken, then we don't know what your argument is. If they state that the statement is accurate, then you should provide evidence as to why the TRC got a fair amount. So remember earlier on I did tell you about selecting evidence from the source to support your point of view. And if they indicate that the statement is inaccurate, then you also need to substantiate. So in other words, there should be evidence again. So in summary, this is about using evidence to support the point. It really doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with a statement. What matters is how well you use the evidence to support the point of view that you have taken. Now, in terms of the main aspects that you need to look at is, obviously, I've told you the structure of the essay. Introduction, you need to explain the purpose and the work of the TRC just to set the scene. That's very important in history, because if we don't know the context, we don't know the background, then we won't understand your argument. And then in your body, the body of your essay, you need to elaborate. So if you are saying that that statement that they did get a fair amount of truth is not accurate, then you're going to look at some of this evidence, like some perpetrators did not appear before the TRC. I'm not going to read everything because it's a long answer, but you will be taking from both the sources and your own knowledge. And then if you're arguing that it was accurate, then you will say that yes, the TRC did get a fair amount of truth because national unity was promoted through the hearings across the country. So they did not choose which areas they go to. They went all over the country, and it was also televised, which means there was public involvement in the entire process. And then both sides of the conflict came to testify. So you had people from the liberation movement and people from the government, and then you can give examples. These are just some of the examples, but you can give your own as well, from who the members of the ANC were at the time, or any other liberation movement, and the government people, the security police at the time. And then the amnesty led to perpetrators' willingness to testify. People did come forward because they were promised that amnesty, and the victims were promised the truth. The victims came to know what really happened during the apartheid years. Many unaccounted victims were identified. Graves were located and bodies exhumed and given to families to rebury, because what had happened was that, remember, South Africa's past was hidden from them. The security police would kill the people and not tell the families. So the families were able to find closure. So it led to reconciliation and nation building. And then in your conclusion, which is another very important aspect of the essay, because it's not an essay without those three structures: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Then you should tie up your argument. You are not changing the position you've taken. You are not changing your line of argument, you're just tying up. You are not repeating the entire essay, you are just summing up. So that's it for today, grade 12s. I hope you will find this year's exam very, very nice, and good luck to all of you. Goodbye.